Witam Państwa. Miła informacja, nie będzie 5 minut, już za...
Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin slightly earlier than expected. We always like getting the good news, and we tackle every challenge with an open mind, which is why our festival about the climate will focus on positive scenarios, of which there are many, but I won't be telling you all about that. Let me once again welcome you and thank the organizers, thank everybody who made this year's festival possible, the United States Embassy, the Austrian Cultural Forum, with Director Gudrun Hardiman-Polros personally, the Institut Français, the French Embassy, and the British Council. And once again, welcome to all of you who have come here to personally take part in the opening of this year's festival, and all of you watching out there in front of your screens. I'm sure we have an interesting evening ahead of us, and now I'd like to hand it over to the management of the Copernicus Center, Director Robert Filmhofer, and the Director of Events, Katarzyna Młynek. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 9th, or is it 11th, Przemiany Festival. And before we introduce the subject matter, let me say something about the history of Copernicus, the Copernicus Center, something which is relevant today. Our venue, this building, this center, would not have ever been built without the support of the European Union, without EU funding. In 2010, 206 million zlotys, 50 million euros were allocated for the construction of this building. Every year we host over 1 million visitors. We support thousands of teachers, tens of thousands of students and pupils, giving them a chance to experience real science. But it's not just about money, not just about funding. Thanks to our friends from other centers in the European Union, which have similar science centers. Thanks to them, we learned what it's all about, how it all works. They showed us the ropes. They were very generous in sharing best practice and doing so free of charge out of the goodness of their hearts. And then together we carried out projects during which we learned a lot. So if the Copernicus Science Center today is ranked among the best institutions of its kind in Europe, it's thanks to, and I quote Isaac Newton, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and that allows us to see a bit farther. And it's important to bear that in mind, especially today. The Przemiany festival is being organized for the 9th time. We had a 2-year hiatus. We try to see from various perspectives. We look into the future, but we're very much grounded in the present. We also look back on occasion. We look at events, trends, and changes that are global in nature, but we also always adopt a local perspective, sometimes a very local perspective of Warsaw or even this particular district of Warsaw, Powiśle. We look at the great ideas of science and see how they translate into best practice, into specifics. And finally, we adopt various perspectives, various sensibilities. We look at things in terms of scientists, from the standpoint of artists, activists, and from the standpoint of each and every one of us, because all of us have their own unique perspective on things, and this gives us a much broader view. As you surely know, this year's festival is and will be about the climate. And we're happy that there is academic consensus that the climate is changing, and it's anthropogenic, caused by even the NASA temperature model, and the IPCC report confirms this. I'm all the more happy that the Nobel Prize in Physics went to scientists specializing in modeling the climate. And yet, despite this academic consensus, climate is a divisive issue. It polarizes societies, countries, businesses, and the approach to climate, a person's attitude to climate can be divisive. We have climate denialists who reject this point of view, and then we have persons who are involved, but persons who are anxious, who are lapsing into despair. And they even speak about the end of civilization. And there is reason for concern. This is a quote. People who considered themselves children of the Enlightenment were in the shadow of ignorance and denial. And this is a quote from a book by Naomi Oreskes, who will be delivering the lecture today, a book from the collapse of Western civilization. The book tells us what happens now, what will happen in the foreseeable future from a much more distant perspective, from 300 years into the future. And it tells us about events that are disastrous, that begin with a small rise in sea levels. Then there are floods and droughts. There is famine, migration, undesired social events, war, and finally, ultimately, the sixth great extinction occurs, leading up to the near total extinction of the human race. So the book is cataclysmic, although civilization is revived, however, after a terrible disaster. This is not a scenario that is bound to happen, but it's a scenario that may happen. And this view, based on solid academic, scientific premises, should spur us to action. Kasia mentioned the Nobel Prize. Professor Klaus Hasselmann, one of the winners of the Nobel Prize in Physics, said, upon learning that he had won the prize, people need to understand that to avert something that might happen 20 and 30 years into the future, we need to act now. And I think of another date, 1987, when the Montreal Accord was signed in order to fight against the hole in the ozone layer. 196 countries agreed to restrict the emission of CFCs. And we were able to cut them down by nearly 90%, according to UN projections. By 2060, by the year 2060, we will have the ozone layer will have regenerated. What does this tell us? It tells us that if we act together, we are capable of action, of achieving things. And on this positive note, we'd like to begin this year's festival. We are pro-climate. We want to talk about the actions that can change something, that can make a difference tomorrow, the day after, and in 10 years' time. Kasia mentioned the ozone layer, but in this room, 3 years ago, we had Professor Mario Molina, Nobel Prize laureate, Mexican professor, who told us about his efforts, scientific and also social, to convince society, to convince politicians, and to overcome lobby. He referred to a book by Professor Naomi Oreskes, Merchants of Doubt, in which she describes specifically this situation. So it's something that recurs clearly. So again, I wish you a very inspiring evening, an inspiring three-day festival, lots of energy, preferably from renewables, to cope with these difficult challenges that ahead of us. Thank you very much. And our first inspiring speaker at the festival will be Krzysztof Kornas, who's the curator of our festival.
Bardzo krótko będę mówił, więc już za chwilkę.
I will be extremely brief, and we will soon go on to listen to Professor Oreskes. I would like to point your attention to the uniqueness of our lecture today, because she is not only a historian of science, and she's looking at civilization within the perspective of several centuries. She has a great understanding of earth science and the physical processes behind climate change. And given the media disinformation of today, she is somebody who is very much aware of how these issues are communicated to the public. She straddles investigative journalism and history of science, and this has allowed her to answer the question, why is there so much doubt and misinformation in the media over the last 3 decades? We've mentioned several of her books, so we might add a few words about one of her newest books, entitled Why Trust Science, in which Professor Oreskes analyzes collective enterprises in science. And this is key for understanding why science is so essential. It's not an endeavor by a handful of scientists, but it's a global collective. And it's very hard for these ambitious, intelligent people to reach consensus. So whenever they do, we can say, well, then there's certitude. In terms of climate change, there's definitely a scientific consensus. So today we will find out why it's worth trusting science and why there are nonetheless science deniers, people who don't trust science. So I invite you to listen to Professor Oreskes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person. So as you heard, today's festival is going to try to focus on positive scenarios. And so I won't talk to you about the collapse of Western civilization, but I will talk to you about the work I've done on trust in science. And so if we could have the first slide. So my topic today is, why don't people trust science? As you've heard, again, there's a scientific consensus on the reality of man-made climate change. That consensus has been around for a long time. Klaus Hasselmann, who we just heard about, was one of the people who helped to build that consensus through the work he has done on climate fingerprinting. But as we also all know, the last few years have been tough for science. New COVID-19 variants have emerged, just as scientists warned a year ago that they would. Here in the United States, millions of people remain unvaccinated, even though vaccines have been shown to be safe and effective and are widely available for free to all Americans. Governors across America have overruled cities and school boards to forbid mask mandates, even though the science shows that masking works to slow the spread of the virus. About half of Republican voters are still skeptical that anthropogenic climate change is real. And across America, and this is maybe the most disturbing part, science teachers face serious obstacles, hostility, sometimes even violence, when they try to do their job, which is to teach science, particularly the science of evolution, in classrooms. Okay, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the technology here. Okay, I'm trying to get my slides to move forward, but they don't seem to want to. I wonder if is it possible for you to advance the slides over at that end? Do we have some tech support? Okay, there we go. Okay. Oh, now it's working again. All right. So, and many of you, if you read scientific journals like Science or Nature or The Lancet, you will see many articles talking about the crisis of trust in science. Now, the fact is that most of these supposedly contested issues, the science itself is not actually contested. So most of us know that qualified experts are nearly unanimous that humans have evolved, that the COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective for most people, and that human activities are driving disruptive and dangerous climate change. Among scientific experts, none of these issues is controversial. All of them are matters of expert consensus. So when we say they're controversial, what we really should say is they're not controversial among scientists, but they are culturally contested. And so my work is interested in part in trying to understand, why are these things culturally contested? Why don't people trust science? Well, actually, the good news to start off with is that actually most people do trust science. Now, the data on these are complicated, but overall, we can say that science itself is not in a crisis, that the scientific enterprise in America and Europe is alive and well and thriving. If we consider the events of last year, when a new virus emerged onto the world, what we saw was that in just a few weeks, scientists around the globe were able to identify the new virus that was causing the COVID-19 illness by sequencing its DNA. Now let's stop for a minute to think about what a huge accomplishment that is. When I was a child, DNA sequencing didn't exist. Today we take it for granted and we use it effectively. And very quickly, in under a year, scientists around the globe produced not just one, but several vaccines with very, very high levels of efficacy. So I believe that these results show us that our global scientific enterprise is working well. When a new problem emerged that required scientific expertise, scientists stepped up to the plate and they did the job that we asked them to do, the job we expect them to do, and they did it very well. Now, of course, vaccine success is just one example. We have many, many other examples where scientists are doing their job well. In my public lectures, one of the climate denial tropes that I often encounter is the claim that people make that scientists are always getting it wrong. So I ask people, well, what science exactly are you thinking about? And when I put the question back to that, typically they have no answer because, in fact, they don't actually have examples. So I decided it would be worth asking the question, well, what about climate science? We know that lots of people, particularly in the United States, resist accepting the scientific findings on climate change, say that scientists are always getting it wrong. But have scientists got climate change wrong? Well, no, they haven't. So in a new paper that's under review right now that I've written with my research associate, Jeffrey Supran, and Potsdam climate scientist, Stefan Rahmstorff, we went back and looked at a set of climate models that had been put together in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s or early 90s, and saw what did they predict would happen in the climate system and what actually happened in the climate system. So the gray lines here show the predictions. The red line is what actually happened in the real world. And as you can see, this red line tracks right smack in the middle of almost all the climate predictions, with the exception of one outlier model. So we see that actually climate science has a strong track record of predictive success. Now, there's a fun punchline to this particular study. If we ask the question, well, where did this particular set of models come from? The answer is ExxonMobil scientists. I'm having a little trouble with the technology here, but this will give you a chance to breathe and think about what I've just said. Okay, so, but more to the point, so we have 2 points here. One is that scientists are doing their job and they're doing it well. The second point is actually the evidence we have does not support the impression that there is a massive crisis of trust in science. The evidence does not support the impression that distrust in science is rampant or dominant. So if we look at evidence on this from public opinion polls, so most of what we have on this comes from public opinion polls. Okay, I'm still working on the technology here. Okay, here we go. So if we look at the evidence from the United States, we see something rather interesting. Now, it is true that in the United States, levels of trust in institutions are kind of mixed. Many institutions, like banking and the government, have very, very a lot since the 90s. Science, which is this orange line here, we find that actually science is among the most trusted of institutions. The only institution trusted more than science is the military. Moreover, and this surprises most people, I show the level of trust in science among the American people in the 70s. So this is not consistent with the idea that there is a massive crisis of trust in science. If we ask the more specific question, to support government funding, investment in science pays off, 71% of Americans say yes to that. So again, that's not consistent with massive hostility to science. And moreover, sometimes commentators will say, well, people believe in technology. They want the technology that science gives us, but they don't understand the relationship between science and technology. But actually, when asked, does technology pay off, 72 people say yes to that. So in other words, almost exactly the same. Americans support investment in science, and they support investment in technology. If we look at the rest of the world, we find that there are cultural differences in how people view science in different countries. But overall, in most countries in the world, we see fairly to very high levels of trust in science. So when the question was posed, do you have at least some trust in scientists to do what is right for the world? In most countries around the world, large majorities of people say yes, they do have at least some degree of trust in science. So again, that goes against the sort of negative or depressing idea that we have a giant crisis in our hands. I'm going to skip this slide because I think we've already covered it. So what's going on? The polling data do not support the idea that there is a general crisis of trust in science, either in the United States or in other countries. Well, one thing that's going on has to do with the dominant media narrative. So as I've already suggested, if you read Science magazine or Nature or The Lancet or many other scientific journals, there has been a narrative of a crisis in trust, narrative of a very severe problem. But this narrative is not actually consistent with the data. So we see scientists are actually being kind of unscientific about the social scientific question of what's really going on. And that invites us to do a deeper level of analysis, to try to better understand and unpack what in fact is going on in the world. And why we have that doesn't seem quite square with the survey data, the large-scale survey data. Okay, so one thing we do know about this problem is that there is a high degree of political polarization about questions of authority, both in the United States and in many other countries. So if you ask people, well, who do you look to for authority? and you compare different potential sources. You'll recall in the earlier slide I showed in the United States, the two most trusted groups are science and the military. So if you ask people, well, who do you look to for authority? People on the left of the political spectrum, so people who self-identify as progressives or what in the United States tend to high level of trust in science and a rather lower level of trust in the military. You ask people who self-identify as being on the right, Republicans in the United States, Tories in England, Christian Democrats in Germany. Well, actually, Germany's an exception. That's a bad example. But Christian Democrats in Austria, let's say, they tend to trust the military. So there are big cultural differences in who people look to for authority, depending on what their political orientation is. Now, the interesting exception actually is Germany. Oh, and I should say these patterns recapitulate themselves in many countries, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom. The exception here is Germany, where there's a low level of trust in the military among all people, and I think most of us know why that is. Well, I'm still having a little trouble getting these slides to move, but that's good. You can study the slide while I try to move to the next one. So it gives you a little extra time to look at the data. But there's a more important thing that this reveals. When we see that opinions about authority are posed by political orientation, that is an invitation for us to look at questions about how other beliefs affect how people think about science. And this falls into the category that cognitive scientists would call motivated reasoning or motivated cognition, that we don't judge facts in isolation, but we evaluate those facts in the context of our other beliefs, our feelings, our commitments, our religious views, etc. So how we view particular scientific claims depends to a large extent, for most of us, on how they mesh with our other beliefs. So this leads us into the category that I have called implicatory denial. What our research shows, and it's supported by the research of others as well, is that people don't generally reject science across the board. So if you ask people general questions about trust in science, many people will say, yes, I do trust science. Specific questions about specific sciences or specific scientific findings, then you find many people resist science when they don't like its implications or its perceived implications. So the science seems to imply something that clashes with their worldviews or their political ideology, and then they selectively reject that science. So we have three examples that are well studied, and my data here comes from the United States because that's where I live as well, although they may play out somewhat differently in other countries because of different attitudes towards religion, towards capitalism, towards individualism. And upon the culture, we can expect to find somewhat different results. But the basic concept, the concept of implicatory denial, I believe applies pretty much everywhere there are people. So the three areas that are very well studied in the United States are evolutionary biology, climate change, and then just this year, COVID-19 and the problem of mask and vaccination rejection. So let's look first at evolutionary biology. So many scientists think that rejection of evolutionary theory is rampant. And they also think that what drives that rejection is, quote, religion, that religious people reject evolutionary theory because it conflicts with a literal reading of the Bible. And so many scientists think that this is the problem they're facing. But actually, the problem is rather more subtle than that. All of the available evidence suggests that this has almost nothing to do with literal readings of the Bible. But it does have to do with people's views about the role of God in our lives. So one interesting thing about evolutionary theory is that it fits a pattern that you see in many areas of public opinion polling, that the answers you get are sensitive to how the question is posed. And in this case, they're highly sensitive. So if you give people just two options, and one of those options is essentially the scientific view that people have evolved from other forms and that God played no role in it, or that humans have existed more or less now, always the way they do today, fully 30% of Americans will take a view that is inconsistent with the scientific theory and evidence. But if you give them a more subtle framing in which they have three options, one of which is that humans have always been exactly the same as they always are, the other that is essentially evolutionary theory, that humans have evolved, but also a middle option where humans evolved, but possibly God played some role in it. There could have been some divine element. Then the numbers who take a position that is completely at odds with science reduces to only 18%. And so what we see more sophisticated or more subtle polling is that many people in the United States are reluctant to leave God out of the picture entirely. They're not rejecting evolutionary theory wholesale. They're willing to accept that people probably or maybe did evolve, but they still think that God played some kind of role. Now, whether this is right or wrong, of course, as a scientist, I can't say, and I don't wish to attempt to judge. The point is not whether the views are right or wrong. The point is understanding where people's views come from. So what we see here is consistent with previous studies, that Americans are not rejecting science across the board, but they're resisting certain elements of evolutionary theory whose implications they don't like. And in this case, it's the implication that God is not present in our lives, that God is not immanent. And of course, the reality is that many evolutionary theorists are people of faith. It's certainly possible to accept evolutionary theory and also believe that God has a role in our lives. And so just again, to give you some examples, if you read the work of people who actively reject, publicly reject evolutionary theory, they don't say it's because it clashes with a little reading of the Bible. They don't invoke the book of Genesis. What they say are things like, evolutionary theory means there's no God. Evolutionary theory means life is random and therefore has no meaning. Or as Rick Santorum, the senator from Pennsylvania, once said, evolution makes humans into mistakes of nature. And he doesn't want people to be mistakes. Now, here's where there's a positive intervention that can be made, because most of us know, or if we don't know, we should know, that science does not disprove the existence of God. Science does not tell us the meaning of life. And science does not tell us if people scientific questions. Now, admittedly, sometimes scientists like Richard Dawkins have asserted these things, but I want to say that when Richard Dawkins says these things, this does not sense of God. It never has, and it never will, because it's a theological question, not a scientific question. And so what we can understand when we look closely is that people are tripping up over theological, philosophical, metaphysical, and political questions, and those questions cannot be answered with more science. They can sometimes be answered with more philosophy or more history. So, for example, see if I can get my next slide. If we properly explain what scientific theories can and can't do, we can sometimes address these questions. And this is what has been done in some American universities, particularly some very nice work at the Arizona State University and by the National Center for Science Education, with whom I'm affiliated. So one thing we can do is to acknowledge the relevant intellectual distinctions, to say that the existence of God is not a scientific question. Evolutionary theory does not take a position on the existence of God. Some scientists believe in God, some don't. And you can also assign readings to students written by scientists who are also themselves people of faith, like Sir John Houghton, Francis Collins, Catherine Hale, and others. And what we find is that when you do that, student resistance to learning about evolutionary theory is greatly lessened. And of course, we know that students can influence their parents and other elders in their lives. So it shows that there are ways to address the problem that can be effective without denying people's faith. Put it another way, we can address implicatory denial by showing that there are other ways to view the matter. Now note that this is very different from just giving them more scientific facts or trying to refute a particular creationist argument like arguments about the evolution of the eye. If you argue the details of evolution, if you just give people more scientific facts, you're actually missing what their concern is. But if you can distinguish between the physical and the metaphysical, or the scientific and the theological, and show how science and theology can complement each other rather than refute each other, then you don't miss the point. And then there's a possibility of reaching through to people. So let's look also at climate change. So for many years, many scientists that I worked with thought that climate change was that skepticism about climate change was being driven either by lack of scientific understanding, by public lack of scientific literacy, or because the uncertainties surrounding the science were too great. And so many scientists and scientific organizations spent a lot of time trying to improve communication and also trying to decrease the uncertainties associated with key climate indicators. So for example, if you followed the work of the IPCC, you know that they have put a lot of time and effort into what they've called uncertainty characterization, with the idea that if we could reduce the uncertainty, that then maybe policymakers would be more willing to act. Whoops. Well, again, oh, sorry. Ugh. Well, again, my work and work of others show assumption is actually incorrect. If we look at climate change denial, we find that it is deeply, deeply politically polarized. The most recent data from the United States shows that something like 94% of people who call themselves liberal Democrats accept the scientific findings, believe that climate change is underway, believe that it's making hurricanes worse, et cetera, et cetera. But among conservative Republicans, that number drops to 17%. And this is consistent with political polarization that we see overall with respect to environmental issues in America. So people are not reacting to the details of the science. People are reacting to what they see as the political implications of climate change for passing laws or regulations to address it. And one thing that's really interesting and important to understand here, so this graph shows the increase in political polarization between Democrats, shown in blue, and Republicans in red, on a variety of environmental issues, not just climate change. And what you see is that this polarization increases dramatically after the year 1990. Now, this is very interesting because those of us who have followed climate science know that in this period, so the IPCC is created here, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is just here. This is the period when the climate science went from just really beginning to coalesce to have, we have the sort of the first IPCC statements of a scientific consensus here in 1995. We have Jim Hansen testifying here in 1988 when the IPCC is created. So this is the period where the science really comes together, where many of the uncertainties of the past were actually resolved. So while the science is getting stronger, Republican support for action is getting weaker. And so that tells you that the problem here is not the science. And it was really this observation that the polarization and rejection of climate science increased while the accuracy and certainty of the science was going up, that led me to try to understand the politics and the ideology of climate change denial and science denial more broadly. And so that's what led to my 2010 book, in which we showed that the people who were rejecting climate science had the ozone hole, as you heard referred to just a few moments ago, but also the harms of tobacco and the damage of acid rain. And what we showed in this book was that these objections had nothing to do with the science. They weren't about the science. They were about the politics and the political implication that our market-based system was failing us in really important ways, that climate change and the health effects, health damage from tobacco were market failures, and that governments needed to intervene to remedy the market failure. And that clashed with the political ideology of conservatism, or in Europe, some elements of neoliberalism, that wanted to leave solutions to the marketplace. And so rather than adjust their ideology, they resisted accepting the science that pointed to the need for those changes. And this set of ideological commitments to low taxation, low regulation, limited government interference or limited government in the marketplace led to a political alignment in the United States in which climate change denial, explicit outright denial, calling it a hoax, bringing a snowball to Congress as if somehow that proved anything, with conservative anti-regulatory and anti-government politics. And my new book comes here looks more closely at this long history of the conservative alignment in the United States with pro-market and anti-government policies and ideologies. Okay, so how do we address this? If we know people who are skeptical about the reality of climate change, what do we do? Because like evolutionary biology, it's not going to solve the problem to just keep giving them more science. Another IPCC report will not change this as far as the evidence goes. But the problem is a little bit trickier than with evolutionary biology. Because when it comes to evolutionary biology, we can say categorically that evolutionary biology does not disprove the existence of God. That is not something that any science can do. But climate change does challenge excessive faith in markets. It does challenge the whole set of neoliberal policies that have dominated in many parts of the world since, well, I guess since the 1980s or so. Put it in a slightly softer way, climate change shows the limits of free market policies and points to the need for government-led solutions. And that is a real tension. And how do we address that? How do we address that with people who are, sorry, I'm having a problem here again. How do we address that with people who are reluctant to accept that? Well, I think first of all, we have to accept the reality that climate change is a market failure. And here I draw on the path-breaking work of Nicholas Stern and his important report some years ago now on the economics of climate change, in which he called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. Climate change is a market failure. And because it's a market failure, it challenges the conservative belief in so-called free markets. And it challenges conservative belief in limited government. Because market failures require exogenous solutions. That is to say, solutions that come from outside the marketplace. Or put in plain language, government has to do something. So one answer is to say, well, we do need government-led solutions, but they don't necessarily have to be big government solutions. We've been working for a long time on the Montreal Protocol as our model. The UN Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol were modeled on the success of the ozone treaties. And at the time, that seemed to make sense. And I don't fault the people who took that approach. But now, here we are 40 years later, and what we've been doing isn't really working. So maybe one of the things we can think about, at least here in the United States, but also in other places where these issues come up, is to think about smaller, more local-led solutions. So solutions on the provincial level, the state level, even cities. One of the things we know is that climate change is driven by economic activity. Most economic activity takes place in cities, and the trend, global trend, is for more and more people to live in cities. So if cities can take action, for example, by having a city-based carbon tax, that could really make a big difference, even if we can't get agreement in Glasgow. And there's one additional important point. Climate change denial is mostly misdirection. That is to say, the climate skeptics and deniers will beat the table about free markets and limited government, but the reality is that the fossil fuel industry is not remotely a free market. Fossil fuels are hugely, massively subsidized. And in fact, a new report just came out that was written up in The Guardian yesterday. And I was teaching all day yesterday, so I didn't have time to update this slide. But the IMF back in 2015 estimated that the world spent $5 trillion on energy subsidies. And almost all of those subsidies, almost all of them, went to fossil fuels. Many people have the impression that renewable energy is heavily subsidized, but the reality is really the opposite. The fossil fuel industry is massively subsidized, but they're trying to distract us from the realities of those subsidies, from the realities of the cost of climate change and the reality of market failure, so that we somehow think that fossil fuels are working well, when in fact they're not working well at all. And so one solution that you can offer to conservatives is to point out that the free market solution to this problem is to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. All right, well, it's getting a little bit late because of the technical problems. This talk has taken a little bit longer than I had hoped. So I think I won't spend time on the final unit about COVID-19, but I think we can say that we see a similar pattern. The issue is highly polarized. Something like 80% of Americans now who are registered Democrats have been vaccinated. Much lower number, something like 30 to 40% of registered Republicans. And like climate change denial, mask resistance and vaccine rejection tracks with conservative rejection of what's seen as, quote, big government. And we see this clearly in the rallies and protests that have occurred in the United States against mask mandates. Again, we don't have a lot of poll data yet because this is a relatively new issue, but we see that in the protests against mask mandates and against vaccine mandates, an emphasis on the values of individualism and personal rights, that the government shouldn't be telling me what to do, that it should be up to me to decide for myself and my children whether we get vaccinated or not. And so many people who reject mask mandates see the rejection as a kind of standing up to tyranny, a standing up for liberty, a standing up for individual rights. In a sense, it comes down to an old ideology in the United States: don't tell me what to do. Now, there is an element of mass rejection which can be viewed as an extension of science denial, so people claiming that masks don't work. So in that sense, it's similar to climate deniers who claim that we don't really know if there's global warming, or claim that, we don't really know if it's caused by people. But the key thing here is that the claims aren't really motivated by uncertainties in the science, because the evidence for the efficacy of masks is clear, but it's motivated by an alignment with certain kinds of politics and ideology. So in all of this, there is rejection of science, but the rejection of science is not a cause, it's an effect. Most of this is not primarily driven by distrust in science, much less by epistemic problems in science. And so it cannot be solved simply by doing more or better science, or by communicating that science clearly. Now, I'm not saying more science isn't a good thing. It may well be a great thing. And communicating clearly is always a good place to start. But it's really important to understand that most of this resistance is being driven by theological, political, ideological, and personal concerns and beliefs. So as I've just said, the rejection of science is not the cause, it is the effect of politics and culture. And this makes it very hard for scientists to address, because fundamentally the debate is not actually about the science. Well, I'm almost done, so if the computer freezes completely, then I'll just wrap up without slides. Well, okay, here we go. There was one more thing I wanted to say, so I'm glad that these fine slides talk. So one of the things that comes out from this research is that it's really, really important for all of us, whether we're scientists, teachers, whatever, to talk about the issues with our friends and our families. One of the things we've seen, and again, public opinion polling and psychological and sociological research affirms this, when an issue becomes deeply polarized, many of us shy away from talking about it. We don't want to antagonize our friends or our families or our neighbors. We don't want to start a fight. We don't want to start arguing with someone in church or synagogue or temple. But studies show that when people share their concerns with colleagues, friends, and families, when they talk about the issue, it helps to depolarize it. Not in all cases. Sometimes the polarization has become essentially hopeless, but in many cases it helps. And we understand this because of what people in communications theory call the trusted messenger effect. In general, studies show that people are more likely to believe a message when it comes from, quote, a trusted messenger. And in most cases, what that means is someone that they already know and already trust for other reasons. So it could be a family friend, could be a family member, could be a family doctor if you have a doctor you see on a regular basis, maybe a neighbor who's a nurse or a school teacher, could be a member of clergy if you attend services regularly, someone you already know and you've already built a bond of trust with in other contexts. This also explains what I like to call the celebrity effect. One thing that's kind of weird is that we know that if scientists talk about science, many people just don't listen, don't believe it. But if a celebrity talks about it, if the celebrity endorses a particular drug or a particular food or a particular kind of makeup or hair product or skin product, many people believe that, even though these are just celebrities, right? These are actors. These are people who are being paid to endorse these products. So why is that? Why do people believe celebrities making claims about drugs or food? Well, the answer, I think, is because even though people don't actually know the celebrities, they feel as if they do. We feel as if celebrities, famous actors, models, influencers on Instagram, athletes, we feel as if we know them because in some way they are part of our lives. And so because we trust the messenger, we tend to trust the message. Now, the bad news is that this is one reason why scientists are generally lousy messengers, because it turns out that most people don't even know a single scientist, not a one. In fact, most Americans can't even name a single living scientist, and I suspect in Poland probably everybody could name Copernicus, but whether they could name a living astronomer is a different question. So we can't rely on scientists to solve this problem, actually because there just aren't even enough of them. But the good news is you don't need to be a scientist. The most trusted messengers about science are not the Centers for Disease Control or the World Health Organization or the IPCC. They are the people in your own community. So this means that it's crucial to talk about these issues, not to shy away from them, and not to leave it to the scientists, not to think, oh, it's their job, but rather to take on that job in our own lives with our own friends, families, neighbors, and colleagues. Humans are social animals. We are all influenced by what the people around us think and feel and say. So just talking, you don't have to be an expert, but just talking about why you care about climate change, why it matters to you, why you got vaccinated, why you want your children to learn about evolution can make a difference. A few years ago, I was part of a campaign here in the United States on social media, and it was Why I Act on Climate. And people showed pictures of their children, their gardens, beautiful places they loved, ski resorts they went to personalize and say, this is why it matters to me. And this, we know, can make a difference. Simple, ordinary conversations. And that is something that all of us can do. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Dziękujemy bardzo pani profesor.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor. And now I have a question to our audience. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Professor Oreskes? We have a roving microphone. Professor Oreskes can hear us, so take advantage of this opportunity. Hands up if anybody has a question. Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question. You said that it's worth talking with your friends and relations, but how do you go about this? How do you do this? Because I know from experience that that can be the most difficult, actually. Those are the most difficult conversations you can have. It often comes down to who owns whom, or, arguments flying about. And when you're not scientists, you run into a wall at some point, so it leads to a dead end. And it can also sour your relations with your loved ones.
I'm not saying that these conversations are necessarily easy, and certainly not easy to begin. But at the same time, many of us can be in situations where something comes up. So, for example, I knew a graduate student once who was working on something to do with fisheries, and she sang in a choir. And she recounted a story where people in the choir started asking her about climate change. And her reaction was to think, well, I'm not a climate scientist. I work on fish. So I really can't answer that question. And I think that's wrong. Because the people had asked her, they had opened a space to talk about the issue. They were curious, and they saw her as someone who might know a little more about it because she was a scientist, even though she wasn't actually a climate scientist. So what I'm really talking about is taking advantage of those kinds of opportunities when they arise, not shying away from them. So I'm not saying you should start a fight with your brother, or your mother or whatever. I mean, if you know someone is super entrenched, you might just say, okay, I'm leaving it for now. But maybe one day something will happen. Maybe there'll be a flood in their own hometown. And then there might be an opportunity to say, well, I don't want to be doctrinaire about this, but that these floods are being made worse than climate change. And sometimes those incidents where something has happened, or maybe you're watching television and it's about the floods in Germany or about a heat wave in Australia, sometimes there are these opportunities where you can begin to talk. And so it's really about looking for those productive opportunities.
Jeszcze pytanie.
And now we have a question from somebody watching online. One of them was in English, so I'll read it in English.
If scientists can't address this trust deficit or the issues the trust deficit impacts, who can? How do we start to remedy this situation?
Yeah, so I'm not saying that scientists can't address it. I think there definitely are opportunities where scientists can, particularly, if you get invited to speak to a local school, or maybe you have an invitation to speak with a local church group. And I know I get invitations like that all the time, and many of my colleagues do. But the important thing to recognize is that if you have that kind of an opportunity, it is not going to necessarily be the best use of the opportunity if you simply come prepared with a ton of scientific facts. What would be more useful in many cases, at least this is what our evidence seems to show, would be for you to begin by asking them a question. Say, well, what is your concern? Are you skeptical about the reality of climate change? And if they say yes, and say, well, why are you skeptical? What is your worry? And sometimes people will say, well, I think it's going to be used as an excuse to raise my taxes, right? And then that can open up a conversation to say, well, there are many ways that we can address this problem that don't raise your taxes. Or like one of the things I like to do in the United States is talk about the example of acid rain, where the industry said, oh my God, if we do this, the price of electricity will skyrocket. But we passed emissions trading under the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, and the price of electricity actually fell. And we know why that is, because when the law required the industry to pay more attention to pollution, the industry invested in better technology, in upgrading plants, and also in finding low sulfur sources of coal. So it became an incentive for the industry to do a better job, and the price of electricity came down. And that's a story that I find when I tell people, many people are shocked. They don't know that happened. And then there's like, oh, okay, so there might be a way for us to do this that doesn't drive up the cost of energy.
Czas na pytanie z sali.
Questions from the audience?
Scientist, and I study physics, so I can just speak in terms of this point of view. And I wanted to ask if there is a research of the scientists who can claim that they trust science. And then I also mean that the science, I trust science as an idea of science, but also I have a lot of bad examples, such that sometimes I cannot trust science because I see how fundings are changing at this point. So then, if someone will ask me if I trust science, I will say I trust idea of science, but if I trust average scientist who is in front of me, not that much.
Yeah, well, that's a great comment, and I totally agree with that. And so in my book, Why Trust Science, essentially I'm making that argument that the call to trust science is a call to trust science as an enterprise, as a way of looking at problems, as a way of examining evidence and data. It doesn't mean that all science is trustworthy or all individual scientists. And in fact, when I first started this project, the initial title was Why We Should Trust Scientists. And that's the TED Talk that you can find on the internet. And then as I started working on it, I thought, it's actually the wrong title, because actually we shouldn't trust individual scientists. We know that individual scientists can be biased. We know they can be bought. We know they can be arrogant and stupid. But science as an enterprise, as a process, has mechanisms for filtering claims and for weeding out error. And so in the book, I look more closely at that. And I try to say, well, how does that really work? And does it really work? And then I look at some specific examples where it didn't work. And I try to talk about what went wrong. So it's not a call for blind faith at all. It's not a call for blind trust at all, but it is a call for a kind of informed trust in the process, in the enterprise, and to say that the enterprise of science is worthy of public support, it's worthy of public funding, and in general, unless we have reason to disbelieve it, and I talk about what some of those reasons could be, if we have to make a public policy decision, let's say about vaccinations, in most cases, we're going to be better off accepting the scientific evidence and the scientific conclusions than some snake oil salesman or some politician, who tells us to take an untrusted drug or to reject the vaccine.
Pytanie z sieci.
Tak, mam jeszcze jedno pytanie z sieci, również
We have a question online in English. I'm not sure whether the person asking the question can bolster the question, can provide arguments, but here goes.
You have linked climate change denial to the faith in the free markets. Why denial is so common among people who are not free market beneficiaries?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Not a wrong or bad question. So let me break it into pieces. When we wrote Merchants of Doubt, what Eric Conway and I were trying to understand was, where did climate change denial come from? Because we had studied the science, we understood the science, and we thought the science was pretty robust, that it didn't just rely on models, that we could see that scientists had been working seriously on this question since the 1950s, so lots of time to answer and sort out. And so we started looking closely at the people, a certain group of people who were very prominent in the United States. And those people had written a lot. They'd given speeches. They'd written letters to each other, which had been preserved in the archives. So we had a lot of documentary evidence about their thinking. And what that documentary evidence showed beyond any reasonable doubt was that they were motivated by market fundamentalism. And what it also showed was that they made common cause with other conservative organizations in the United States, such as the Cato Institute or the American Enterprise Institute or the Heartland Institute, which were free market, pro-market, anti-government public, think tanks. And what we also showed, the documentary evidence showed, was that they didn't start out being linked to the fossil fuel industry. We thought this was one of the interesting findings, but pretty soon the fossil fuel industry realized that these were really nice arguments that could help them. And so the fossil fuel industry started funneling money into these think tanks that were promoting climate change denial in the interest of free market policies. And so it became a kind of political nexus of politics, ideology, and money. And that, of course, is a pretty powerful thing because ideology on its own without money, it may take hold, but it will have a much harder time. And money by itself without some kind of credible intellectual framework, what we see through that is just industry self-interest. So what we argued was that this was kind of a powerful nexus. And then it gets picked up by the Republican Party, and then it becomes an article of faith among Republicans. So I think there are lots of Republican voters now for whom it's not necessarily a highly studied position, but they know, people, I've heard people say this, I'm a Republican. There's a scene in our film where this radio announcer in Mississippi says, as a Mississippian and a conservative, every bone in my body tells me that this can't be true. So then it becomes a kind of social and affiliational thing. So even though you may not have any stock in ExxonMobil, you still tend to reject climate science because that's what conservatives in America do.
I kolejne pytanie z sali, może mamy?
Any takers, last chance?
There were not too many references in your slide to social media platforms. And I was wondering if you'd like to share with us what's your take on that, and perhaps some remedies.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things we know is that many of these patterns about the rejection of evolutionary theory or the rejection of vaccination predate the rise of track many of these trends. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback, so I'm just pausing a second here. So we can track many of these trends back to the 1960s and 70s before the rise of social media. So we know that social media didn't create this polarization, and social media didn't create the implicatory rejection of science. However, I think it is definitely true that social media has made it worse. And certainly in the last 2 years or so, we've seen a lot of evidence of the fossil fuel industry using social media very aggressively, having lots of advertisements on Twitter and Facebook in order to promote the idea that, they're great and they're doing all these wonderful things. There was just a piece in the paper here in the United States yesterday about how Chevron has had a huge ad campaign in the last year. 80% of their ads are about their work in sustainability. Less than half of 1% of their budget is for initiatives that you could plausibly call sustainability, and that includes things like carbon capture. So social media has definitely played a role. I think it's probably exacerbated some trends that already existed that are now worse. We do have studies that show that lies spread much more quickly on Twitter than truth does. So we have evidence on that. But it's a little bit hard to know exactly how it's played out because we haven't had a lot of good studies yet. And actually right now, my research associate, Jeffrey Supran, and I are trying to raise some money to do some work to look more closely now on how disinformation spreads on social media. So stay tuned, and hopefully a year or two from now, I'll have something good to report on that.
I jeszcze jedno pytanie.
So one more question. Yes, I have a question on allies of science. We've mentioned that already, but I am interested, and this might be a little provocative. So in terms of climate change, a lot of people are doing the right thing, not necessarily trusting science, not necessarily signing up to the discussion on trust in science. So should we engage those people who are profit-oriented, who want to profit on energy transition, for instance? Or another important question, educationally and culturally, who want to do the right thing, to have them do the right thing for the right reasons, to get them to do the right thing for the right reasons?
I think politics is all about coalitions. I think all social change is about coalitions. So I think if there are people who are doing the right thing and their reasons for doing it may be different than yours, I don't think that's a problem. And I certainly don't have any problem with someone who can develop a company that can produce a good wind turbine and make money on it. I think we need that, and I think we want that, and I think that's a really good rejoinder as well to some of the market fundamentalists who are rejecting climate science to say, wait, hold on, but there actually are market-based solutions to these problems, right? And look at this wind turbine company, or look at Tesla. I mean, there are many, many good private sector solutions to aspects of this problem. And where we can find those private sector solutions, I absolutely think we should embrace them. The only caveat there is, are they real solutions or are they greenwashing? So we've certainly seen some cases, and I think for sure in the oil industry, where, you know, if you go to the homepage of Chevron or ExxonMobil, they'll tell you about all the great things they're doing. And most of it, in my opinion, is bogus, because either the scale is way too small to be significant, or because even though they might be doing these things that, yes, actually are okay, but meanwhile, they're spending, you know, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and continuing to produce and explore for new oil and gas fields. So there's a disconnect between the scale of their fossil fuel operations and the scale of some of these other things like algae biofuel, for example. So I think we do have to be alert to greenwashing and to bogus claims about doing the right thing. But if we are, you know, if we can identify companies or individuals who we believe are genuinely doing the right thing, even if their reasons for doing it are different than ours, I think that's fine. And I think that's life. I think that's how the world is. I mean, no two people will ever have exactly the same reasons for doing what they do. But as long as there's overlap and as long as the reasons are compatible, then I think not only is it okay to do that, but I think we need to do that.
Czy jeszcze jakieś pytania? Tak, widzę jeszcze.
I would like to ask, in your opinion, starting from yourself and introducing changes in your daily life, the things you can do on the personal level every day, does that contribute to improving the climate situation? Or are global changes more important? And only change there makes sense? Or should we still try to make some changes in our daily life?
It's a very important question. I get this question all the time. So I'll try to give a both-and answer. I think that personal commitments, what you can do in your own life, is very important. And I think it's important for a few reasons. I think the most important reason is that this is a really, really difficult problem. It's a very hard problem, and it's one in which it's easy to feel despair and hopelessness. But if you do what you can do in your own life, whether it's putting solar panels on the roof of your house if you own your own home, or buying an electric car if you drive a car, or taking the train, or eating less meat, these are empowering things. And you can feel better about the world because you know that you at least are doing what you can. And you can go to bed at night feeling better about the situation because you know that you aren't making it worse. And I think that's incredibly important, especially an issue like this that is so hard and so difficult. That said, it's very clear that that by itself is not enough. And it's not enough for a number of different reasons. I mean, there was a study that just came out a few days ago that I saw that estimated that about 4% of emissions are things that could be controlled by individuals making personal choice, and the other 96% are structural, associated with industry and the structure of the energy economy. So obviously, if what we can do is only 4%, then we can never fix this problem only by focusing on our personal actions. So we have to look at the larger structural issues as well. One of the ways I like to think about it is I can change my light bulbs. And in fact, I have. All my light bulbs are now LEDs, and they're all powered by the solar panels on my roof. And I'm glad that I have that, and it makes me feel better, and I can talk about it. And it also helps address the so-called hypocrisy accusation, right? But I also know that that alone is not enough. And so that's why I have to become active to work to not just change my light bulbs, but to change the electricity grid and ultimately to change the entire electricity generating system.
Ostatnie pytanie będzie z sieci.
The final question will be from the web. What to do with the myth stating that ecologists are the first to prohibit things? the myth that ecologists are basically just want to prohibit everything, and I don't know if...
Osoba, która zadała to pytanie w sieci.
So the person who asked it online basically asks you to dispel that myth.
Well, it is a myth, and it's a myth that has been propagated by the fossil fuel industry and by other interested parties who want to discredit the ecological movement. And it's completely ridiculous because, of course, the whole point of the ecology is ecos is life, right? I mean, ecology is about life. It's about the interconnectedness of all the beautiful and amazing life on Earth, human life, plant life, animal life, birds, insects. It's about how we can't survive without pollinators. Pollinators can't survive without trees and flowers. I mean, ecology is the science of the interrelationships between all living things on Earth. And the idea that ecologists are somehow anti-life is just, it's so disgraceful that someone would even say that. I think anyone who makes that claim should hang their head in shame, because everyone I know who's involved in the climate movement, every scientist I know who works on this issue, whether from the biological or the physical science side, is doing this because we care about life on Earth and we want to preserve the incredible beauty and wonder of the natural world. You can call it creation, you can call it biodiversity, however you like to think about it, and because we don't want people to suffer. And what climate change amounts to at this point in history is that a small group of people and corporations are making huge amounts of profits at the expense of all of the rest of us.
Dziękujemy serdecznie pani profesor. Ja dziękuję również państwu, ale to jeszcze nie jest koniec naszego wieczoru.
Thank you so much, Professor Oreskes, and thank you to everyone. But it's not the end of our evening. We invite you upstairs to show you our exhibition space. Thank you so much, Professor Oreskes. It was wonderful to listen to your lecture. We are very grateful.